This video will show you how to create a grid of charts, that is, a single chart that presents its dimensions and measures in a grid-like layout. To do this, first add a chart component and resize as desired. First, add a single dimension and a single measure. In this case, we'll add the state field to the x-axis, and we'll add the total field to the y-axis. Now let's add a second measure. In this case, we'll add quantity purchased to the y-axis as well. Note that this creates two separate y-axis regions. Thus, we have already created a grid of charts. This is a grid with 2 rows and 1 column. If we were to add additional measures to the y-axis, we would get additional rows on the chart, each measure acquiring its own y-axis. Let's add another dimension to the x-axis. In this case, we'll add the region field. This now breaks out the data both by region on the top x-axis as well as by state on the bottom x-axis. We now have a grid of charts with 2 rows and 2 columns. Keep in mind that if you have multiple measures and you want to display them on the same axis rather than on independent axes, you can always press the Switch to Single Graph button in the Data panel of the chart editor. This will place the 2 measures onto the same axis, although here you can see that because the 2 measures have greatly different magnitudes, the quantity purchased measure is not visible. In this case, it's usually best to add a secondary axis, which you can do by pressing the Edit Measure button next to the measure that you want to put on the secondary axis and selecting the secondary axis option. Now we have a grid of charts with 1 row and 2 columns. If you wish to visualize another dimension, you can do this by placing it on either the x-axis or the y-axis. In this case, let's break out the data by year on the y-axis. Drag the date field to the y-axis region. Note that the y-axis now represents the different years in the dataset. We now have a grid of charts with 4 rows and 2 columns. When the number of charts in the grid becomes too large to display, there will be a scroll bar on the chart that allows you to scroll to see all of the data. To see this, let's change the date grouping from year to quarter. To do this, press the Edit Dimension button next to the date field and switch the grouping level from year to quarter. Press the green Apply button, and note that there is now a scroll bar on the chart that allows us to scroll to see all of the different quarters of data. By adding additional dimensions to either the x-axis or the y-axis, you can build up a more complex grid of charts. Keep in mind, though, that in many cases, it is easier to represent a dimension using the formatting options in the visual panel at the bottom rather than using the x and y axis. For example, instead of representing the year on the y-axis, we could consider representing the year by using color. Let's switch the date field back to display the data at the year level, and then drag the date field into the color region of the visual panel. This will code the different years by using color. This is a little bit hard to read because the 2 measures are still together on the same axis. In this case, we might choose to switch the chart back to separate axes by pressing the Switch to Separate Graph button. This chart has all of the same data as the previous chart, but is using color to represent one of the dimensions. In many cases, you may find that using the formatting options in the visual panel to represent dimensions or measures provides a cleaner, easier to read chart than stacking up multiple measures and dimensions on the x and y axes. Let's return once more, though, to the previous configuration. And note that if you are using multiple dimensions and measures on the x and y axes, you can adjust the display of the grid by dragging on the dividing lines between the grid regions. For example, to compress this chart vertically, click and drag on one of the dividing lines between the quarters to make the chart more dense or less dense. Similarly, in a case where the grid of charts has many columns, you can make the columns more dense or less dense by dragging on the dividing line between the columns.